Good day everyone, my name is Gabriel, and today we'll be continuing with our tutorial series on all things CEMENTO. So CEMENTO, just as a review, is a package that allows you to convert your draw.io diagrams into tutorial files and vice versa. If you want a more in-depth introduction to CEMENTO, feel free to refer to the first part of this video tutorial where I go into depth into all of its features. Today, however, we will be trying to recreate a draw.io diagram from scratch. In particular, we want to recreate the diagram you see on the screen today. Now, this tutorial won't claim to teach you how to make an ontology or how to do it properly, nor will it claim that this ontology is actually complete. This is just for example and for your reference. If you want to learn more about what ontologies are and what the proper syntax is to write them properly, I have a link to several web pages in the description below. Now, if you want to follow along this tutorial, make sure you have CEMENTO installed, and you are free to refer to the first part of the series or check the documentation page, the one you're seeing right now, for instruction on how to do that. Once you have the package installed, we can begin. So right here, you see a file called draw tutorial that is blank with no elements on it at the moment. Now you see I have the shape palette open on the left-hand side and the style palette on the right-hand side. If you want to start creating terms, all you have to do is import a basic shape from the palette you see here on the left. In this case, I like rounded rectangles. And note that you can use any basic shape here, but beware, we haven't tested more complex shapes like containers. This will be more relevant in a future release, but for now, I'll stick to basic shapes like circles, ellipses, rounded rectangles, and the like. You can even use clouds. Clouds work. Now, one thing to note is because any simple shape works, this text box will actually be part of your ontology. And that means annotations are currently a no-go. The only exception, of course, are three elements. They're shapes that have T-box and A-box. And also, lines that don't connect to anything and that don't have labels. Apart from these three exceptions, every simple shape you put will be part of your ontology. And the reason we exempt these three things is for people who want to separate their terms with T-boxes and A-boxes. It's just a nicer way to draw your diagram. Now with that out of the way, we can begin with our term. In this case, we can begin with MDS water vehicle. So a term will always have two parts. There's the prefix that represents the namespace, and there's the name of the term itself. And to understand what those two things are, we can go back to our tutorial file and look at water vehicle. So you see here, water vehicle is a class, and you see the same format that I've mentioned before. And this prefix, as you will see here, is actually just a shorthand for this very long URI. So if you want to refer to the actual term, its real URI will actually look like this, and water vehicle. And as you can see, this term right here is the last part of this very long URI, and MDS is just a shortcut. So all of our terms work like this. If you go back to our diagram and drop this prefix, it will get added MDS regardless. And this is just because our default namespace is MDS. Now let's make another term. I import my shape. I add text. In this case, we'll call it vehicle. Now, before we go and connect it, as you might expect, there is something important about this vehicle term that you need to understand. And that's that vehicle prefix is a custom prefix that I made that isn't part of the default namespace. What does that mean? It means that I'll have to add this prefix to a prefixes file myself, right? The way to do that is very simple. If you go back to their folder, you will see that there's a prefixes.json. And if you don't have this file yet, you're free to copy paste this. This is available in our examples page. It's also available in the documentation. And this prefixes.json is literally just a Python dictionary written in the JSON format. And if you wanted to add your own custom prefix and namespace, all you have to do is add it at the bottom right here. right? In this case, I have a prefix called vehicle, and my new namespace called http example.com vehicles. Now, obviously, if I export this ontology, this won't resolve because example.com is not mine, and I'm guessing no, it's not yours either. But if it's yours, lucky. But if you do have a website, you just replace this with whatever URI you have that represents where the documentation resides for your ontology. Now that's out of the way, we go back to water vehicle. You can see that it will have this namespace right here, and that is the MDS namespace. But if you go to vehicle, you can see that vehicle is already added in this turtle, which resolves to this prefix right so. Now, we'll discuss on how to input your prefix later, but please consider that for now, the prefixes are an important part of custom properties, right? And this is how you add it. You add it at the bottom of this prefixes file. Okay, so that's a mouthful, but how we actually connect these three things and form a triple. That's very simple, and as you might have guessed, you could draw an arrow that goes from your term to the other term. The only important part is two things. Number one is if you're going to put a label on this arrow, you need to double click and add it directly. In this case, since vehicle is a class and water vehicle is another class, we could do subclass of. And when you do properties like so, you can see it also follows the same format. Prefix for namespace and the actual name of the term. In this case, RDFS is part of the default namespace for ontologies, and subclass of is a reserved keyword for this particular purpose. Now, one thing to note when drawing arrows, you could draw arrows in different ways. If I delete this and press this up thing right here, it will also create an arrow, but it's important to just make sure that this arrow is actually connected. One good way to check is to wiggle this and to see it actually moves along. But another thing to note is if you go to click on your arrow and click on style, you'll see this box right here. This means that this arrow has an end arrow, but no start arrow. And that's what we want, okay? Sometimes Dryo will do the opposite, and it will look like this. And it will look correct, but when you process this file, it actually goes the other way. So that's just something to keep in mind, okay? So now let's recreate our arrow. Another thing, the second thing I wanted to mention, was if you wanted to add labels, it's incorrect to do this, right? This also looks correct, but this will not resolve. In fact, once we pass this to our error checker, this will have problems. You write your labels directly on your arrow. You can even press enter if you're on Mac, F2 if you're on Linux or Windows. Okay, so now we have our first triple. That's a very simple triple, but as you will see, this will get processed. Now, another thing to note is when making terms, you're free to style them in whatever way you want. In this case, Dryo has this really nice set of predefined styles they could just click on and select from. And I like this in particular. And CEMENTO doesn't really care how you style your elements. You can literally style them in whatever way you want. You can even make them invisible, but as long as they exist, they exist. So it's up to you how you want to format them. We do have a system that I will discuss later on in the video on how we do things over at MDS3 and SDLE. But if you have your own scheme and it works and it's uniform and it helps you, feel free, all the power to you. So now that I have this triple, I'll just go ahead and make even more, right? So I have a vehicle, I have a water vehicle, and this is a subclass of vehicle. What else is a subclass of vehicle? A land vehicle. Right? I could just keep adding more triples. So feel free to stay if you want to skip through the video, you're good. But I'll just be trying to recreate the reference that I showed you in the beginning. Hmm? This is motor vehicle. Okay, so another thing to note is now we're making a vehicle, amphibious, that can potentially have two different parent classes. And in this case, CEMENTO allows you to just directly link them like so, or you can even just do multiple inheritance. Now, BFO doesn't recommend you do this, but it is there if you really need it. Okay, now if I click on this, okay, so now our ontology is shaping up to be something more complicated than we initially had, and that's good. Now, what if I want to make an instance of something? Let's say I have a car, that's a subclass of motor vehicle, and I want to instantiate a car. Well, for us, it's very simple. An instance is just another term. Now, one thing to note is that instances also need namespaces, and there's a reason for this. An instance has to belong on a namespace, so it's universally accessible. And if you're doing this for fair principles, it's the letter A and it's the letter F. And so it might look weird to you initially, but we prefer to add namespaces even to instances. But just for the sake of example, I can create a car called Totoya Kami. That is definitely not the same as any real car out there. Just kidding. Obviously, it's a play on the name. And all we have to do is to use the proper object property. In this case, it's type. So now I have the Toyo Kami, which is a car. Now, some of the better practices here at SDLE is we prefer to make all of our instances white background and have dashed lines. That way it's easier for us to spot which is a class and which is an instance, especially for larger graphs. If you want to follow along, you're free to do so, but again, formats don't matter. Okay, I have an instance. Now I have an instance of a Totoya Kami that I actually want to drive. So let's make a person. In this case, I could do the same thing, but now I'm importing from CCO. So this is one of the more powerful features of CEMENTO, is that you actually don't need to manually import terms from a specific set of ontologies. All you have to do is to make the ontology part of your input. So let's say I have CCO right here and I want to refer to it. What I want to do is download the file. And make it part of my input. So in here, you have source, we have merged, and thanks for the folks at CCO for making something very usable. Amazing. And you download your tutorial file. You see here, Common Core Ontology. But if I go back to my code, I already downloaded it here. So here you can see it's the same file you saw. And what CEMENTO does is if you add this to your input, which I'll show how to do later, you will be able to import all of these and search through all of these. Okay, so let's go back to drawing our diagram. We have a CCO person right here. And what does CCO person have? An instance. In this case, let's say it's me. So I'll have a classical driver. Now obviously CCO is a better way to model this, but we'll keep it as an example for now. So this will be a subclass of person. And you can even use reverse, by the way. Reverse is right-click reverse. Yes. And as you can see, still the same format. We're good. And if we want to add a label, this will be RDF type. Just some little neat tricks that you could use when you're creating your own diagram. So now I have driver, person. This is wrong. This will be me. In this case, it's fitting that my namespace is MDS because they actually work there. So same thing as before. I like yellow, I like each lines. Right, don't quote me on that. And then there's this white background dash thick lines. Awesome. So now I have Gabriel. So another thing you might want to do is create an object property. If I want to link Gabriel to Toyota Camry and say I want to drive the Toyota Camry, then I could do that. All I have to do is connect them like so and use my custom term. In this case, I'm fine with MDS and I want to call this object property drives. And now Gabriel is now driving Toyota Camry. Well, I wish, but out of my budget. So Now, what if I want to define this object property? If you input this to CEMENTO at the moment, you will actually parse and you will actually have an object property called drives. But if you're making an ontology, I think it's better to be more precise. Don't you agree? So now I'll just copy paste from my reference, paste it here to create a definition for an object property. And as you can see here, drives has the same name as here, and that's by design. Anything that you call the same name will be parsed to the same thing. So in this case, anything that I add to drives here will refer to the same drives that is in here. Okay, and that makes organizing much easier if you don't want to have arrows pointing everywhere. In this case, it's impossible because this is literally an arrow. In Draw.io, there's no way to draw from an arrow. But if you find a way, let me know. So I have MDS drives and it's an object property. And I told you in a previous episode that CEMENTO doesn't really support much of the axioms. And we're only able to support simple ones like this RDF domain, RDF's range at the moment, just because they don't refer to a blank node or a collection. So you can do something like this if you're just modeling very simple things. You could do so. So now, what if I wanted to define a definition for drives? So drives, like any other class, will just need a connection to that term. And in this case, this box right here is no longer a class or an instance. This is an actual literal. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are quotes surrounding it. And in CEMENTO, any box that has a quotation in it will be considered a literal. So if I were you, I would avoid using double quotes in my definitions and names. And that's not good practice either. And if you want to define it, all you have to do is to use the ESCOS definition annotation. And ESCOS, for people who might not know, is also part of the default namespace that is for annotating classes or instances or literals to each other. And this is an actual valid term. That means that I want to define this class, in this case, an object property, with this literal. Another thing to note is, you see how there's an at English at the end? Now, if I wrote this in Spanish or another language, I just have to change this data type. So, Espanol, like this, like so. Now, you could even do data type annotations like this. And in this case, this is redundant because obviously a definition is always going to be a string. But for XSD terms, you could also use numbers. In this case, let's say 0. I like 0. 0 is a really nice number. And I can convert them to a decimal, for instance. And what CEMENTO will do is it will run a package called rdflib, which is one of its core foundations, by the way, to convert this string right here into a decimal. And that decimal will be part of data type. But you're free to try it out. For this particular case, we're just going to go with a definition. Now, we have a definition like here, an object property that defines drives, and we have drives right here. And this is shaping up to be just like what we have before. In fact, I think we're actually done. So now I'll show you how to actually run the command. So I saved this in a file called draw tutorial. And the point here is you can save it anywhere you want, but as long as it's accessible to your CLI. And today I'll only be discussing how to do a CLI because it's a much easier thing to demonstrate. And it's also what most people will use. CEMENTO has scripting support, so you're free to look at the documentation how to do that. We've recently added fixes, so you're able to reproduce the same things here with the scripting framework, right? And so, but for us, we like the CLI. CLI is good. And for CLI use, it's very simple. If you need help with the CLI, type in this, and it will show you what I've already had before. Now, CEMENTO has different subcommands for converting into the different formats. There's draw.io to turtle, turtle draw.io. There's also the download subcommand if you just want to download CCO, for example. But CCO is pretty accessible from GitHub anyway. This is just if you really don't know where to look for it. So it's right there. Now, to use a subcommand, just type it out. The subcommands also have help messages. And here, I have many different things I could do to convert from draw.io to turtle. And I won't discuss all of it just for the sake of time, but you're free to explore everything that we offer, right? You have all of these default parameters that you have to input, and there's also this one. But for the sake of example, Let's just try it out. So I have CEMENTO IO, and it says that my first positional argument is an input, and the second positional argument is the output. So where's my DRIO diagram? It's right here, DRIO tutorial. Now, if you're using the CLI, you could use relative paths, or you can even use just absolute paths. It's up to you. I prefer relative paths just because I know where it is, although that's not always going to be the case. And now I have my input, draw tutorial DRIO. Now for output, I'll just call it the same way. Right? And if I do that, now this is what happens when there's an error in your file. It will actually tell you what it is. And in this case, it says that the prefix vehicle was used, but it was not in default prefixes.json. But wait a minute. I showed you prefixes.json has a vehicle. And the reason this thing still complains is because we forgot to input our prefix. Do that, -p, prefixes.json. In this case, draw tutorial. Now it's not complaining. And if you look at the file that just got generated, you'll see there's your tutorial output. Now it is good practice to check if it actually corresponds. And for this case, it's pretty simple. So I recommend you just look over your diagram, see if anything's off. But for now, it actually makes sense. You see that the multiple inheritance actually got integrated. Amphibious vehicle is a class that's both a land vehicle and water vehicle. That's nice. A boat is a water vehicle. That makes sense. And you see how drives gets merged into one thing. So I have the main driver, I have arranged car, and now you see it's capitalized, and that's just because any class or term you add will get formatted the same way. If you don't like that, you could just go back to your tutorial file and edit it directly. The point is that this tutorial file is now a valid input to any other part of your pipeline. If you're making RDF triples, this is a valid tutorial for your ontology. If you want to put in a graph DB, you can also do that. We've tried that before and it works. So sky's the limit from here. You could do whatever you want with it. You can edit all of these statements. If you want to add axioms and restrictions, this is a good place to add it. You can see that even the literal is added, and you see that there's a type annotation right here, and that's good. That's what we want. So that's just CEMENTO. That's what it does for you. If you look for types, you will see that the turtle syntax uses A. Sometimes you'll see in reference ontologies, they'll use RDF type. But for turtle, A is kind of the idiomatic way to do it. You can see Gabriel actually drives a Toyota Camry. Isn't that cool, right? So now I have all these statements about my instances. And again, you could use it in whatever way you want. Keep going. I see that my input is going well. Now, how about inputs that you import? For example, this term right here is very weird. And apparently, it's actually the class person. And this class person actually doesn't belong in our ontology. It belongs in a CCO ontology. So what actually happened? What happened was when you install CEMENTO, you actually have CCO installed by default. And this is for when you don't want to input anything and you're using CCO. And the reason why we default with CCO is because that's the preferred ontology for our lab. But you could, again, as I told you before, input any file that you want. In fact, let's go do that now. So if I go make a folder, and let's call this folder data, and this is where I want to put all of my reference ontologies. Since I already have CCO downloaded here, why don't I just use that, right? And if I create the same output, it should have worked. So I'll go ahead and go here. And this is where the help message is very helpful because it will tell me that if I wanted to insert a prefix, this is the option to use. If I wanted to use a reference folder, this is the option to use. So now let's do that. Data -p prefixes and tutorial. So you can see it parsed, and you can see here nothing much changed. It's because it worked. Now if I wanted to add PMDCO, for example, I'll go to the GitHub pages I've shown you before, and I downloaded and put it in the data folder as well. And you can keep going and going and going. One thing to understand is that all of these references are additive. and they override each other. So if your PMDCO file has a different prefix than your CCO file, you have to fix it, right? CEMENTO's hands off when it comes to that, just because people need to adopt standard terms for all of these things. And it's good practice if you are able to harmonize it as well. Okay, so now that you know how to import those ontologies, we're pretty much good. I think that's it. Now, one thing to understand though, I think this is the final note before we can terminate the session, is that what if I have a term Gabriel, right? That's already in CCO, right? And I don't want this to be CCO Gabriel. I want this to be MDS Gabriel. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because when you make a new term like this, CEMENTO actually uses fuzzy search to match everything, right? And that has several advantages. That means if I make a small mistake like this, I'll still match the subclass off. Actually, let's give that a shot. Okay. And the one we misspelled was car to vehicle. Okay. You can see it still matches the subclass off. So that's a good thing. That's a feature baked into CEMENTO. The downside, of course, is when your term is very close to somebody else's term, then we start having problems. And CEMENTO has a solution for this. All you have to do is add an asterisk. And this tells CEMENTO, don't match this thing, keep it as is. And don't worry, if I run this again, you will see that Gabriel is still Gabriel, no asterisk added. It just means that Gabriel will always be MDS. It's not going to get matched. Okay. So that's it for this tutorial. If you have any questions, please feel free to just put in the comments below, or if you don't prefer that, or if they do turn it off for some reason, YouTube sometimes turns it off, you could open an issue on our GitHub page. It should be in the documentation, which is in the description below. So that's pretty much it for our diagram. We've made a really nice one here. You can go to whatever depth or complexity you want. So just to kind of motivate this before we end, we actually have a more complicated diagram like this, and this is a valid CCO input. So another thing is you could also add different tabs, pages as they are called, and just draw them there. And that way, because all of the terms are the same, they match the same thing, you could organize things your way. So that's it for this tutorial. Thank you so much for listening. The next episode is going to be about error checks. So it's kind of like an extra episode, a sub-episode, if you will, that kind of appends what we've learned today. And that will show you how to fix common issues with CEMENTO. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next one.